what cohabitation means to you.
It might be sort of like a coincidence or something, but I've been, being interested in this idea of cohabitation. And of course, this is just a very vague idea. Cohabitation can be many things. This in parallel to many of the readings that I'm doing that are really directly related to the topic of cohabitation, especially Donna Haraway, has made me think many of the projects that I have already done in a different way maybe, and probably project my practice towards the future as well, in another way, in a slightly different way. So I think at the core of what I do is, let's say, is not the idea necessarily directly of cohabitation, but there is a clear sensitivity towards other beings, with landscape, with plants, with animals as well. For quite a time now, but it's also the idea that there's a lot of let's say theory about cohabitation that has opened my eyes towards what I was already kind of doing in my practice, but has put some words on it. Let's say, for instance, many of the cohabitation theories come from, feminism or feminism and ecology, and those readings have really opened my eyes to kind of like put words into a way of rethinking architecture somehow, and what is the purpose of it, and I kind of like feel that I can be a little bit in that trend. Cohabitation in itself, as you might know, what I do is not necessarily building buildings for people to inhabit them, even though a little bit of my practice tackles that issue, but not all. But I've been doing architecture a bit on the side or peripherically or whatever, and I think that has to do a lot with this other view of what architecture can contribute to, actually, not make, but contribute to. And in that sense, I think that is very open to many types of inhabitants somehow. So that's one part of the that's one part of the answer. The other part is that it's funny that I'm working now in a new program for teaching as well, and I really am thinking about a program that would host a multi-species approach to architecture. So that one that breaks down the scale of interventions. If you're working for insects, then there are issues that are very, very different than if you're working for humans, if you're working with insects, not for, but with insects, or if you're working with plants, of course, but even, it can be extremely multiscalar, which is something that I'm very interested in as well. Once again, Donna Haraway is one of the main persons that I've been interested in. Of course, it's Bruno Latour, that it's always there. But Isabelle Stengers or Vinciane Després in France, who's talking, I don't know if you know her, she's talking a lot about animal life. William Cronon, who's an environment historian in the US, and many other people. To do probably less with buildings than with environments or systemic environments somehow. There's a lot of reading around that influences that teaching as well, and a lot of research as well. But what happened was that last year we started, not last year, but the year before, we did this in Evian, which was an intervention that it was a little bit wider and try and comprehend the territory in a more spread way or a more subtle way. And yes, this year clearly we are into questioning how to act upon the territory and how to contribute more than act, and it's so many of the things that we're going to build at the end of the year, if we can. Maybe many of the years will actually not be anything built. And one of the things that we have put also together, I don't know if you notice, is that we have a full program of farming. Because we have a program where every month we have an agreement with the Ferme de Bassinges, who's right next to it. We're doing permaculture. And the students actually go there, and the next one we're planting trees pretty soon in 2 weeks, and it's just out there, and we have discussions with the farmers, and so there's a whole new approach on how to tackle architecture in that sense. And I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary for for not only for a new generation, but for us as well to envisage that, that as architects, we have to also concentrate on other things than building buildings. And I mean, it's so basic somehow, it's funny that we have to read all this theory actually about it. It should be a given for us, it should be like taken for granted, and it's not. We have to read philosophy books, and I'm the worst for that, but where it should be just more than normal that that we have to take care of the things around us, whether they are called plants or animals or insects or virus somehow, or people. Then there is something there that it's interesting and problematic as well, is the boundaries of disciplinary work, of disciplines. And that's also why I'm also interested in feminism, because they usually are transdisciplinary. And this is also very interesting because, as soon as you start, let's say as an architect, getting interested in design, then you actually are a designer and not an architect. Or if you're interested in planting, then you become a landscape architect and an architect. So these boundaries are to be also deconstructed for sure. And this is something that I clearly do in my practice. But it's also interesting as an architect to review what are the possibilities of action that you have or intervention more than action that you have, and what are the the boundaries of the discipline if you need to fix them. Maybe there is not necessary to fix them actually. So I think this idea of cohabitation goes in pair with the idea of, if not transdisciplinary or transdisciplinarity, at least interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. Otherwise we're like kind of enclosed in boxes. Because and actually this is very interesting in the case of Margulis as well, because she was already in her case, microbiology was already another discipline than biology itself. Of course, these are things that we don't know so much about, but for her it was a whole battle to go beyond microbiology and actually have access to biologists. And same goes with Lovelock, that he's kind of like the crazy chemist, and not so well considered as a scientist as well.
So for me, it's interesting when you mention those classes, those boxes, because if you picture a shelf with different boxes which represent maybe different species, but other classifications than architect, landscape architect, urban planner, and whatsoever, those boxes usually are not linked interdependently towards another. You take one box out of the shelf and the others are not impacted by your action. And I guess with Bunker Plus, we are aiming to, we understand cohabitation as something where a lot of entities are interconnected in a very physical way. So it also has something to do with the notion of comfort and discomfort, that it is more interrelated network instead of another kind of classification. It is super demanding because if something changes, naming maybe one contributor brings a new proposal, then all the other proposals of the previous contributors are also alternated. So it's a lot of more work, but I guess that's how we see or how we try out cohabitation now. And I think it gets to a really interesting, complex organism. It's literally being alive somehow.
Yeah, what is interesting in this is the idea of, which is also related to many of the people who talk about cohabitation, is the idea of stories as well. That it relates to what you're saying. How do you link stories? And the stories, they don't need to have a physical form. The idea of creating like storylines, Donna Haraway has a word for this, which is string figures. So it's the same kind of idea where, in a very Deleuzian rhizomatic way, things kind of like melt into each other. And what I find extremely interesting and not so well actually taken care of in our profession is the idea that you have to, in order to build culture, you have to also build stories. So it's not only about building physically, it's also about, what is being told and how is it told and by whom as well, of course. This is something that we can do that probably other species cannot do. Because this is one of the particularities of Homo sapiens. But But I mean, they do it other ways. Of course, they don't talk, or and that's one of the main difficulties of this whole thing about cohabitation is that the dialogue is difficult because we have to switch the mode of communication that we don't even know about. So but of course with let's say with animals it's already different, because with animals you have ways of communicating. I mean, with some animals, let's say. But what I find interesting what you're saying is that these stories then what is happening here, they can be part of the next story, and however all this linked is kind of like elastic somehow, and you can build up a full amount of culture by interventions, stories, fictions, realities, and they are part of the same line somehow.
I think it's also related to tools, no? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are the tools staying the same for us as architects, for instance? Because this is also a question that we have to ask ourselves now with this Mäusebunker, with this case study in Berlin that we do. Maybe it's related to something that we said before. Are we designing with the animals or for the animals? And if we do so, with what tools do we do it? We will never be a dog, so can we really design for a dog?
No. I think it's just creating a relationship. Once you create a relationship, and this is something that it's very, how to say, it's not so even in between humans in the architect's usual brief. Even the worst example, which would be the plants that you're at your home, that are, living with you. You have plants at your home. You have a relation with them, and you create a relation with them, so you know them if they are specifically communicating with you or not. And they probably know how to react. It's not so difficult to imagine how to work with them somehow. And same goes with, let's say, companion animals, companion species like dogs. Of course, that demands, you're absolutely right, that demands completely new tools. That's where the transdisciplinary has to come in as well, because that means that probably we need help as designers, from other disciplines that could help us to communicate or to enter these relations in a different way. And especially when the relations are multiple, so, it's not only animals, but it can be plants, it can be anything. But yeah, of course, communication is an issue, and that's one of the main difficulties. But I think relationship is kind of an answer. If you relate to something, then you can at least dialogue with it. It or yeah, it. Human or not human.
Can one build a relationship towards something that one doesn't know?
Of course,
yeah?
once you have a baby, you don't know him before you have it. Huh?
But this is then it's a super emotional kickstart somehow, no?
I mean, how can we be okay with a tree dying, and we are okay with that, we just, okay, you plant one, then it dies, and it's okay. You don't cry so much, huh? So, and I mean, if you change your mindset, it's maybe you should find that very, very sad, and maybe you should be crying, like when you feel emotions when you lose your pet, that you've been living with for a few years. So once again, this is just a mindset to be changed, and this goes with 2,000 years of human hegemony, that of course has convinced us that we are the only ones who are worth having emotions for. Yeah. Once you start being aware of this interconnectivity that you were talking about, which is so incredibly obvious, we cannot breathe without that. We cannot breathe without the interconnectivity. So once you start thinking about not only the emotional part, but also the necessity of it, that actually it's the others who actually allows us to live, and not the other way around. The others are much more necessary for us than we are for them.
It's a question of mindset. We try to shift our perspective of control, but maybe it's not a question of acting, but more about observing.
One of the things that we need to get rid of is this dichotomical thinking. It's not only one against, or she or me and me or she. I think it's just, once again, interconnectivity. It is not evident that it should be like that. I mean, if you read the some anthropologists talking about some tribes in Amazonia. They are completely connected, even though they are still killing, of course, animals and everything, but they're completely connected with plants, animals, sky, weather, climate, many things. The way man has behaved towards other species has already done towards some members of his own species.
It's a harder process to deconstruct an evolution, which has happened for thousands of years.
Yeah, this is decisive. I think that institutions have an incredibly important role there, and I'm super glad that you guys are doing this, and that you're backed up by an institution, because then enter into that discussion and it's creating that openness to that kind of culture. So yeah, I think that's really decisive. Clearly. That all those issues are, but it's very difficult, and it's going to be very long, because once again that male culture that is very rooted in the architectural culture is very difficult to deconstruct, because you're attacking yourself to a very well constructed historically and culturally building. It's a very robust building that has been constructed for over 2,000 years.
We are super impatient. I mean, as you say, deconstructing stuff is taking a lot of time. And I feel that our generation is really pressed about changing, and this is nice that we want to have a shifting. We might probably be not an observer of this shifting, no? Maybe we'll give this push and this input, but will be done for the other generation. We have to be a bit humble and try to change stuff, not for us, but for the future also, and finding solution.
I absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of let's say, for instance, Donna Haraway, is the idea of substituting the word even of inhabitation by being with. And I think it's very nice in relation to what you're saying, Pierre, is that, it's not about, and this is also a very monumental idea, the idea of change. Your actions need an effect that is visible, whereas if we're talking about taking care of your houseplant, the relation is much different, because as you say, you see it grow. You need a lot of actions there, but actually maybe they're a little bit more micro, and it grows. And it's like planting a tree. You're going to see it grow for years, and probably you're not going to see it grow so much in your own generation. And in architecture, it's very rooted, the idea of you're leaving your trace. Yeah, if you want to provoke change, I think you have to do this kind of like interconnected actions that bring a bit of change, but maybe not so much. But I mean, the idea here is changing the mindset, not changing the world. The world will evolve, and once again, probably the world does not need us to change it. They need us not to fuck it up too much. Even there, all the other species are much more resilient than we are. We're not so resilient, actually.
Architects always want to change the world, because maybe it's easier to change the world than changing the mind and the mentality. And trying to be maybe not the main actor, but to be one of the actors of all this system,
Yeah. So that deconstructs also the whole representation of the architect, of the figure of the architect. And yeah, I mean, just to acknowledge that we're not so important, and architecture is not so important,
That the signature somehow underneath the architecture is not important at all. No. But like this claim of authorship is really, this must be, I guess, through talking and through discussion, through education, this must kind of be grinded down to a more tolerant and humble being within an existing and living environment somehow.
Yeah, and also through storytelling, because once again, I think that, or most of what I have learned comes also from the history that I've read, or the buildings that I've seen. So, how you build up the tale of cohabitation. It needs culture. We need storytelling. We need images. We need text. We need fictions. We need worlds to connect with. that kind of like nourishes our own culture, and then they make you understand. That's why, I mean, that's why you need art as well. You need art to understand the world a little better or a little different, or so I think the storytelling is also incredibly important. That's why I like so much that you guys are working with film. Yes, as architects we can also contribute to that storytelling by making fictions. Why not? Fictions that tackle certain problems, certain issues, and then you create culture with that.
I guess that's why Pierre also likes that the images of Alice are now embedded in a context and not.
Yeah.
We want to create fiction, and that's why we are always pushing more this idea of creating characters, creating stories, creating emotion, maybe.
And the creation of space is only the very last step of the expression at the end of the chain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mm.
It's a pure consequence of the need to will. Maybe really quickly, maybe as an ending point, we had a look at your project Volière. Is it feasible to build a cage for something?
Yeah, actually what it's interesting is that it's not a cage. It's actually a device to protect birds from being contaminated from the flu, from the other birds actually. So it's birds and birds, because that was at the time of the aviary flu. And the migrant, I don't know if you remember, but the migrant birds were pooing on the other birds, and that's how they got contaminated actually. But also I was, at that time, I was very interested in I'm still in the figure of the zoo as a very problematic urban device that has stayed there, totally anachronic, that is still around, and I don't know why. So I was very happy to participate to that reflection with the built work. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of romanticism about it. There's the whole idea of wilderness. It's a construction that we have made because it has got so far away from us that we dream of this. It has to be very contemplative, so we're not so much in danger with it. So yeah, of course, this is one of the first things that you have to tackle, is that how do you cohabitate with species that don't have the same habitus and the same way of being in the world as we do. We're not going to take away the fact that we are who we are, as humans. So we also have to live with that. We're not going to pretend that we can, jump around like deers or be as strong as bears. But that's why we have all our prostheses and, body tools. And that's why we engineer a lot of stuff to resemble to other species that we are not, or birds like flying. And probably in the idea of interconnectivity, we think it as a whole. So there's no nature and there's no human. And, it's just a big bunch of things interconnecting with each other. And this is not less nature than a presumably wild forest, Maybe you should consider, as they were doing, their lawyers, as you might know, that defend animal rights, and they, but maybe you should consider to have animals in your committee. And that's going to bring a lot of very interesting questions.